Ukraine has entered Russia. And in fact, as of yesterday, has blown up 3 bridges in the Kursk Oblast, which oblast is a word that describes a division or region in Russia. So they're in Kursk now. What does this mean? And does the blowing up of bridges? I know they can replace them with pontoon bridges on a moment's notice. So does this really do anything, or is this actually a success story for Ukraine?
It really depends on what Ukraine is trying to accomplish, and that's a bit of a puzzler and a head scratcher. And the story keeps changing, frankly, because we've had Zelensky, and since this thing unfolded, has said variously it's to teach Russia a lesson, so they have the pain of war. He said it was to create a buffer zone. Apparently, yesterday, they said they wanted to exchange prisoners, they wanted to improve negotiating positions, and those things are not mutually endorsement. I mean, they don't work together. So I'm not sure what you're trying to do if you're trying to improve negotiating position, but then you're losing in the east, and that's the biggest issue here. Is that Ukraine, they definitely caught Russia with their pants down. That Russia did not expect an incursion into their country. They had then border units that were controlling the border because they just didn't think Ukraine would do this, and so Ukraine again surprised Russia by amassing a large number of troops, which they deceived Russia into thinking they were actually going to be defensive troops for a Russian incursion in the Sumy area, which is not far from there. But it turned out they didn't, and they used those then to attack into Russia. So now they've carved out this relatively large area, but it's only 3% of the region of Kursk, the oblast you referred to. But the big problem is it's come at the expense of what the Ukraine side is trying to hold on to in the east. And the Russian has not redeployed, according to most reports, at least sizable numbers from that area to try and stop the Kursk area. They've used other troops. Meanwhile, they've continued, especially in a place called Pokrovsk and Toretsk, they've continued to press on, and they haven't withdrawn their pressure. Now that Ukraine doesn't have a lot of troops or equipment to defend that, so they're starting to lose more. So I'm not sure this is going to work out good for Ukraine.
Well, let me ask this. Does this cause any supply chain problems for the Russians? I mean, they got the troops obviously in Ukraine, a physical presence. They're going to have to hold the land that they've taken, which requires an ongoing presence of troops. Correct me at any point if I'm wrong on military strategy on this, but I mean, you can roll through a city and say you took it over and I grabbed their flag, but if you move out, you're not there anymore. I kind of view that back in the hands of the Ukrainians. So does this thin out the available Russian troops to continue to advance, and does it stop supply lines from being refilled and supplies from being reaching the Russian troops?
Actually, it works the opposite direction, and
Really?
in the disadvantage of Ukraine for nearly the same reasons you just mentioned. It's one thing to make an incursion into a Russian territory, but it's a very different thing to hold that terrain. So if you make this big penetration, which they have, and then here in 4, 5, 6 weeks, they end up being pushed out, and because Russia just has more forces up in that area, then I'm not sure what they've gained. And the only thing that it appears in terms of logistics is that there's through a city called Druzhba, I think it's called, or Suja, I'm sorry, Suja, is that the gas lines from Russia to Europe run through there, which gives Ukraine control over them, although there's bypass routes. But in terms of supply for the rest of the war, especially in the east, it's almost irrelevant. It doesn't even have any. It comes from elsewhere in Russia. So those supply lines are unchanged for Russia in the east, in the Pokrovsk and Toretsk area.
How are the Russians doing in terms of troops? I know we've talked before about there's only a finite number of human beings that are capable to fight, and they're blowing through all the younger men, I presume. Those are the casualties of war, and I hear the Russians are running around looking at all the 4 corners of the world trying to find Russian guys to conscript and join the military. They're not at risk of running out of warm bodies, are they, the Russians?
No, they're not at all. Russia's going to do everything they can to get as many volunteers as they can get, or that they can scrape somewhere else without having to have a mobilization. That's in their interest to do so, and they have done it. They've been fairly successful. I mean, according to reports, anywhere from 30 to 40,000 per month in any given month. But obviously the much bigger issue is on the Ukrainian side, which doesn't have anywhere near the manpower pool from which to draw. And they are definitely in the fully coercive mobilization mode. And I don't know if you've been able to see, but there is a lot of consternation within Ukraine. And now some of the recruiters themselves are being attacked by the people who feel that if they come and grab them, it's basically a death sentence. And so they don't want to go to the fight. But once they get there, they are fighting. So I do give them credit for that. But it is a big issue, and they just don't have enough troops to match Russia.
I mean, is this going to be just, does this come down to simple battle of attrition that it's a foregone conclusion Russia can win?
That's exactly how I view it. 100%. It is a foregone conclusion because whether you're talking about manpower, missiles, artillery shells, the ability to create weapons to get them. I mean, Russia has almost 4 times more than the cumulative West has all of together. We can't match what Russia is making with North Korea and Iran as their allies and what they can produce domestically. And then you add somewhere between 12 to 15 million more men from which to draw for potential troops. And you just see that there is no rational path for Ukraine to even hold the line, much less to ever win.
Well, what of our members of Congress who want to continue to throw billions and billions of dollars at if it's a foregone conclusion? And I have to assume that you obviously you served America honorably and are knowledgeable about matters military and strategy. We have to have similarly versed folks within America's military that can see and perhaps have reached the same conclusion that you have. This is a foregone conclusion, a battle of attrition that Russia is most certainly going to win if they just stick it out long enough. Um, is that a wake up call to people who keep thinking that somehow Ukraine is going to prevail in this? I don't see.
There's no wake up call coming. I mean, I had hoped that would be the case after last year's offensive. The Ukrainian offensive in 2023 utterly failed. I mean, to even break through the first of 5 defensive lines of Russia. I thought that would be the wake up call. It wasn't. And then you see Lindsey Graham, who continued to embarrass himself and our country by cheerleading what the Ukraine's doing here because he's going to, quote, kick you Putin's ass and all this kind of stuff, talking like a schoolyard kid with no concept at all of the fundamentals involved here and how by continuing to do that, all you're going to do is get more Ukrainian men killed and probably lose even more territory. There are many calls in Russia right now to say, we don't want to just take the 4 oblasts that we have illegally annexed. They want the whole country now. And whether that's going to be possible or not, it remains to be seen. It has to be done. But Russia does have the manpower and the equipment to make good on it, even if it takes another year or 2 or 3 or whatever. They seem willing to pay that price. And I just don't think this is going to work out good. And I don't want people to forget what people like Lindsey Graham, who are blind to these realities, when they're cheerleading this going on, when we could have a negotiated settlement so Ukraine could keep land. That's not happening. And that's why I'm so upset when I hear comments like Lindsey Graham's.
Yeah, and that you anticipated where I wanted to go, which is okay, fine. Maybe Ukraine did this to show that Russia does have some vulnerabilities. They couldn't hold their own line, but maybe this opens up an opportunity to discuss peace and negotiate some sort of resolution. I haven't heard those words really talked about with any level of seriousness now for quite some time.
Well, see, now here's that. That's why I say at the opening of your show here that there's some conflicting images and words coming out of Zelensky because his chief negotiator, I'm sorry, his chief aide, Yermak, said, I guess 3 days ago, that this was to improve our negotiating position. So Russia has to negotiate from a position from our strength, from our side, so that they know, which is insane. That because Russia got poked in the chest with this 3% of one oblast, that suddenly after 2 years are going to quit with all these advantages. That's absurd. But that's one of the things they're saying. But there's no evidence that they're going to actually do that to have a negotiated settlement because they could do it right now. They don't need to have negotiated settlement because Putin has been saying from the beginning he's willing to do that. But every day you delay, Brian, that he is less and less willing to negotiate and may say, I'm just going to solve this on the battlefield. That's my biggest worry for the people of Ukraine.
Understood. And I just have to ask this question before we part company, Daniel Davis. Search for him online, Daniel Davis Deep Dive. You'd be glad you did. What do we learn from this? We have one of the largest militaries in the entire planet, the Russians, and obviously well stocked with supplies from rifles to nuclear weapons. They have a large military, enough men. You just mentioned they have sufficient people to continue to wage this war. The landmass that we're talking about here, we're not talking about a country the size of the United States or the size of China. I mean, this is a comparatively small chunk of land, and yet here we are. How many years after the invasion? That there's still a fight going on, that this small swath of the globe has not yet been overrun by one of the world's largest, most powerful militaries. I just kind of scratch my head over that. I don't know why it takes me over to Fidel Castro fighting Batista from the mountains. You have an army versus some ragtag guys with an attitude. The ragtag guys with an attitude won. I mean,
Well, yeah, that certainly has been the case. I mean, you could even go to Taliban in Afghanistan for an even
Absolutely.
more appropriate
Absolutely.
analogy. But this is different. This is not just insurgents running around in the jungles or in the mountains of Afghanistan, but it's an army, and armies have different fundamentals, and the fundamentals just don't make it work out for the little guy over time. It's a big question is why Russia hasn't used its power in larger ways up to this point. It's a head scratcher to me because I don't see an easy answer, but they have it and they are methodically employing it. And even though it takes longer than we would think it should, it is still happening.